Uri, at the western edge of the Nile Valley, in the last hour before the sun disappears, the limestone cliffs turn a color that has no precise name in any modern language. It is gold, but gold that has been warmed from within, the pale cream of the stone, deepened by the low angle of the light into something closer to amber, closer to honey. The whole face of the escarpment glowing as though the rock itself has been storing the day's heat, and is now, very slowly, releasing it back into the cooling air. The valley floor below lies already in shadow. The river catches the last of the light on its surface, flat and bright as hammered copper. But the cliffs themselves, the high western cliffs above the Nile, hold the sun for a little longer than everything else, their broad faces tilted outward toward the sinking disk, receiving its final attention before the horizon takes it away entirely. This was, to the ancient Egyptians, the most significant moment of the day, not because it was beautiful, though it was, not because the cooling of the air after the long heat of the afternoon brought its own relief, though it did. It was significant because it was the moment at which the ordered sunlit world of the living, the world of the river and the fields and the cities and the careful administration of human life, gave way to something else entirely, something larger, something that operated by different rules and on a different scale, and that the Egyptians had been mapping and describing and preparing themselves to enter for as long as they had been making marks on stone. The word they used was Duat. It is sometimes translated as the underworld, sometimes as the netherworld, sometimes simply as the realm of the dead. None of these translations is quite wrong, but none of them is complete either. The Duat, in the understanding of the Egyptian tradition, was a specific place with specific geography, with rivers and lakes, with caverns and corridors, with wide sandy plains and narrow passageways, with its own resident populations and its own operating principles, and it had been mapped and catalogued with the kind of patient, methodical precision that the Egyptians applied to everything they considered important, which was considerable. The Egyptians considered a great many things important. The western cliffs were where it began, not in a vague or symbolic sense, but in a concrete and literal one. The Duat opened at the western horizon, at the point where the sun descended below the edge of the world, and this is why the Egyptians built their cities and their temples and their agricultural estates on the eastern bank of the Nile, the side of the living, and their necropolises, their great cities of the dead, on the western bank. The Valley of the Kings is on the west bank. The mortuary temples of the pharaohs are on the west bank. Deir Medina, the village of the craftsmen who spent their lives cutting and painting the royal tombs, is on the west bank. The great necropolis of Memphis at Saqqara is on the west bank. Across 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, in every part of Egypt where the Nile provided a choice of banks, the dead were placed on the side of the setting sun. Standing on the eastern bank in the evening, looking west, the high cliffs would have been the last visible feature of the known world before the desert took over. Beyond those cliffs, the land opened into the vast dry expanse of the western desert, empty, largely unmapped, extending for hundreds of miles into regions where the Nile's green margin finally thinned to nothing, and the ground became pure stone and sand. And to the Egyptians, this was not simply a geographical fact, it was the edge, the place where the living world concluded and the other world began, the place where the sun went every evening, descending through the cliffs and into the hidden realm below and beyond, where it would spend the 12 hours of night on a passage that the tradition described in careful, exact sequential detail. And at the threshold of that passage, In the understanding of the Egyptian tradition stood a goddess. Her name was Amentet, and she is depicted in tomb paintings and papyrus illustrations as a woman of composed and gracious bearing, dressed in the white linen of the divine world, standing at the entry to the western region with her arms open in the posture of welcome. On her head she bears the hieroglyphic sign of the West, a standard or a banner mounted on a short pole, the sign that in the Egyptian writing system simply meant west, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of the dead. It rises from her head like a feather held upright, like a small flag, marking her both as a person and as a place, the way the Egyptians often depicted deities who were simultaneously beings and the principles or locations they embodied. Amentet's role was to receive the dead, not to judge them, not to challenge them, but to receive them, to stand at the entry of the western region with the greeting that any careful host extends to a new arrival, the acknowledgement that the arrival is expected and that a place has been prepared. She is sometimes shown holding the Ankh, the hieroglyphic sign of life, in one hand and the Waz scepter of divine power in the other. She is sometimes shown offering water to the newly arrived dead, because crossing from one mode of existence to another is the kind of transition after which, in many traditions, the first thing offered is something to drink. The western horizon was not only an entry point for the dead, it was the entry point for the sun, and in the Egyptian understanding of how the world worked, these two facts were not separate facts, they were the same fact understood from different angles, because the journey of the dead through the Duat and the journey of the sun through the Duat were the same journey, conducted in the same space, during the same 12 hours of night, and the dead who had been properly prepared could travel in the company of the sun, illuminated by its passage through the darkness, carried in some sense by the same movement that would bring the sun back to the eastern horizon at dawn. This alignment of the solar journey with the journey of the dead gave the Duat a very specific structure. It was not a single undifferentiated darkness extending in all directions. It was a sequential landscape, organized into 12 distinct regions, each one corresponding to one of the 12 hours of the Egyptian night. The first region was entered when the sun crossed the western horizon. The 12th was exited when the sun emerged at the eastern horizon at dawn. Between those 2 points, the tradition had mapped everything, every corridor, every gate, every body of water, every open plain, every population of beings resident in each particular hour, with the same patient thoroughness that the Egyptians brought to the administration of their own grain stores and cattle herds, and the carefully measured boundaries of their agricultural fields. The primary text for this mapping is a composition known today as the Duat, a name derived from the ancient Egyptian phrase that translates roughly as that which is in the Duat. It is one of the oldest of the royal funerary texts, known from the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, though it draws on traditions considerably older than any of the tombs in which it survives. In its physical form in the tomb, the Duat is laid out in horizontal registers across the walls of the burial chamber, long rows of painted figures, and accompanying text, organized hour by hour, region by region, reading like a map and an itinerary simultaneously. Each of the 12 sections depicts the landscape of 1 hour, the name of the hour, the name of its gate, the beings who inhabit it, the events that occur within it, the spells or knowledge required to navigate it successfully. It is, among other things, the most detailed description of any underworld in the ancient world. It proceeds with the calm, methodical confidence of a document whose authors knew the territory they were describing. The first hour of the Duat's 12 is entered through the western horizon. Puit's name, in Egyptian, translates roughly as the swallower of all. The landscape it describes is an open sandy region lit by the last of the sun's light as the bark carrying the sun god descends into it, a transitional space, neither fully the living world nor yet the deep interior of the Duat, where the first populations of the dead gather to receive the passage of the solar light before it moves further in. By the second hour, the waterways have begun, the river of the Duat taking the form the Egyptians mapped as a broad navigable channel through which the solar bark continues its passage deeper into the hidden realm. Each subsequent hour introduces new landscape features, new populations, new challenges to be navigated. The fifth and sixth hours descend into the deepest interior of the Duat, where the sandy plain of Sokar spreads in dense, still silence, far from any water. The seventh, eighth, and ninth hours begin the long, gradual return, the landscape slowly opening again. The 10th and 11th hours bring the bark back toward the outer regions. The 12th carries it through the final passage toward the eastern horizon and the renewal of morning. Each region is separated from the next by a gate. In the understanding of the tradition, these gates were not merely transitions between one landscape and another. They were guarded boundaries, real thresholds in a real place, and the knowledge of how to pass through them was knowledge that had to be acquired, preserved, and carried into the afterlife as carefully as any other useful thing. The Duat and the later Book of Gates that organized the same journey through a slightly different architectural framework were not simply described for the benefit of the reader. They were placed in the tomb because the dead person would need them. The maps in the Egyptian understanding were usable maps. The physical organization of the Duat as a region of the world, extending below the earth, below the desert and the Nile Valley floor, in the deep interior of a space that the living world rested on top of without knowing, was one part of how the Egyptians understood its location. But the Duat had another location simultaneously, and this second location existed without contradiction beside the first, the way that many things in Egyptian cosmological thinking occupied more than one position in the scheme of things without any apparent concern for the logical tension this might create for a differently organized mind. The Duat also existed in the sky. Specifically, it was associated with the circumpolar stars, the stars visible in the northern sky, that never descend below the horizon, that circle the pole in slow arcs visible across the whole length of the Egyptian night, every night of the year, without disappearing. In Egyptian astronomical understanding, these stars were called the imperishable ones, and their imperishability, their failure to set, their continuous presence in the northern sky, made them the natural emblem of eternal existence, of the kind of perpetual being that the successful dead were understood to achieve. The dead who had been properly transformed and justified became associated with these stars. They did not merely go to a place beneath the earth. They became, in a real sense, part of the sky above. From any quiet, dark place in the Nile Valley, on any clear night, the circumpolar stars are visible. They have been visible from that same ground for as long as there have been people to look at them, in the pre-dawn hours, with the Milky Way arching overhead and the desert floor catching the faint starlight. The northern sky turns around its pole in the slow rotation that made the Egyptian astronomers, and they were meticulous and practiced astronomers, understand these stars as locked in a permanent circuit, perpetually in motion and yet perpetually present, neither rising to their zenith nor sinking below the earth's edge. They are the part of the sky that never leaves, and the region they occupy in the sky, in the Egyptian tradition, was continuous with the region the dead occupied below the earth. The underworld and the stars were the same territory, experienced differently depending on whether one was looking up at it from the living world or moving through it from the inside. This is the kind of thinking that the Egyptians were genuinely comfortable with, the kind where two things that seem from the outside to be contradictory are held simultaneously as both true, because the tradition found that both descriptions were needed to say what was actually the case. The Duat was below the earth. The Duat was in the stars. The sun traveled through it underground. The sun also moved through the sky below the horizon of the living world, which from the dead perspective inside the Duat was a sky above them. The dead were in the earth. The dead were luminous and stellar and permanent. None of these propositions excluded the others. They all contributed to a description of something genuinely complex, what it means for the dead to be somewhere, what it means for the sun to travel through the night, what the night is, where it leads, and how morning comes from it. The sky goddess Nut understood all of this, because Nut was all of this. She was, in the Egyptian tradition, the arching dome of the sky, her body the sky itself, her limbs touching the four corners of the earth, her form the great enclosed space inside which the sun and stars and planets all moved. And every evening, at the western horizon, she swallowed the sun. This is described in the tradition in precisely those terms. Nut swallowed the sun when it touched the western horizon at sunset, and she held it inside her body throughout the night, during which it traveled through the Duat, which was simultaneously the interior of Nut's body. At dawn, she gave birth to the sun at the eastern horizon, the disk emerging from her in the form of a scarab beetle, pushing the solar disk upward into the first light of morning. The image of Nut was placed on the interior lids of Egyptian coffins, specifically and deliberately on the interior, the face that would rest above the person lying inside. She is depicted arching across the full length of the lid, her dark body covered with stars, her hands touching the upper corners of the painted surface, and her feet the lower corners, as though she holds the whole night inside her frame. Her expression is serene. Her posture is that of someone who has spread herself fully across a space and is at rest within it. The stars on her belly are not decorative elements. They are the stars of the Duat, the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones, painted in yellow pigment against the dark ground of her skin as they appear against the actual night sky, clustered in their patterns, scattered across the great dark curve of her. The person lying in the coffin beneath that painted lid would, in the Egyptian understanding, spend the night within Nut. Their body was held inside her, the same way the sun was held inside her, the same way the dead were held within the Duat. The coffin, with its painted interior, was not a container for a corpse. It was a model of the cosmos in miniature, the narrow, enclosed night, through which the dead person would travel, protected by the goddess of the sky, who was also the goddess of the underworld, who was also the same darkness, inside which all transformation happened, and all light was secretly maintained, until it was time once again for morning. In the craftsman's village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank at Thebes, the artisans who spent their working lives painting and carving the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived in modest houses on the edge of the desert, within walking distance of the tomb entrances. They were some of the most skilled workers in Egypt, painters and sculptors, and scribes and architects, and they were also, because of the nature of their work, some of the most thoroughly versed in the geography of the Duat of any non-priestly population in the country. They spent their days inside the tombs. They painted the 12 hours of the night on the walls of the burial chambers. They cut the corridors through which the dead pharaoh would, in the tradition's understanding, travel the same route they were depicting. They knew the Duat not as an abstract text, but as a visual composition. They were responsible for rendering accurately, hour by hour, gate by gate, figure by figure. The diagrams of the Duat that survive from ancient Egypt have a specific visual character that is worth staying with for a moment. They are laid out in horizontal registers, typically three registers arranged one above the other, with each register containing a row of figures, divine beings, human souls, serpents, boats, architectural features, accompanied by columns of text identifying them and describing the events of that particular hour. The figures are drawn in the fine, confident line of practiced draftsmen, the reed pen moving quickly and surely across the prepared surface, outlining the distinctive Egyptian profile views, filling in the flat areas of color, adding the hieroglyphic labels beside each figure in the compact, compressed style that the tradition used for funerary texts, where space was always limited and precision was always required. By lamplight in the depths of a limestone cliff, a scribe working on the royal tomb of Thutmose, 3 in the 15th century before the Common Era, would have been producing images of a world that was, in the tradition's understanding, directly below the floor on which he was kneeling. The Duat was not a hypothetical afterlife to be arrived at eventually. It was the actual underground landscape through which the actual sun was traveling at that very moment, if the moment happened to be any of the 12 hours of night. The tomb was cut into the rock of the West Bank. The West Bank was where the Duat began. The craftsman painting the Duat's first hour on the wall of the burial chamber was, by some lights, painting a map of the immediate neighborhood. The Amduat's 12 regions are not identical in character. The first few hours describe an open, relatively navigable landscape where the solar bark proceeds along a broad waterway through populated regions where the dead receive the light of the passing sun. The middle hours grow stranger and more interior. The waterway narrows, the landscape becomes sandier and more enclosed. The populations of beings become more unusual in their forms. The later hours gradually open again as the bark approaches the far side of the Duat and the approach to the eastern horizon. The whole sequence has the quality of a long and varied interior space, not a single tunnel or a single cavern, but something with the scale of a continent crossed slowly, its different districts, each distinct in atmosphere and landscape, each with their own resonant populations and their own particular kind of light or darkness. Some of the Duat's regions are described as lake or river landscapes, their surfaces reflecting whatever light the solar bark brings with it into the darkness. Others are dry and sandy, the desert that exists beneath the desert of the living world, its surface fine and pale and extending in all directions without visible edge. Some are described as cavern regions, their ceilings low and their walls close on either side. Some are described as more open, not exactly open sky, since the Duat is an enclosed realm, but something with the character of a wide interior, a large space with room to move, and air that moves through it from no particular direction. The rivers of the Duat are not the Nile. They are their own waterways, existing independently of the river above, flowing by their own logic through the underground hours of the night. The lakes that appear in the Amduat's geography are named and mapped: the Lake of Fire in the 3rd hour, the Lake of Life that the solar bark crosses in the 5th, the waters of the Duat, through which the blessed dead swim in some of the text's more unusual images. Water in the Duat is not merely geographical feature. It is associated with specific qualities and specific divine presences. To know the names of the lakes, in the tradition's understanding, was to have power over the water, to be able to cross it safely, to drink from it without harm, to navigate the waterway to the other side. The stars above the desert at night are, in the Egyptian tradition, not separate from the realm of the dead. They are part of the same continuous space. Nut's body arches between the horizon and the horizon, her dark skin carrying the stars of the Duat against it, her form the boundary between the living world and the enclosed night, where the sun travels and the dead find their country. Looking up at the night sky from the Nile Valley, from a flat mud brick roof, from a boat on the river, from the open courtyard of a temple, the Egyptians were looking up at the underworld. They were looking through the floor of the sky into the space above it, where the stars were pinned to Nut's body. They were seeing the ceiling of the place the dead lived, observed from below. This is one of the stranger and more beautiful features of the Egyptian conception of the Duat. It was not hidden from the living in any complete sense. It was visible every night, from every part of Egypt, to anyone who stood outside in the dark and looked upward. The circumpolar stars turning around the pole, the slow arc of the zodiacal constellations across the sky, the Milky Way in the very dry desert air of Upper Egypt, blazing white from horizon to horizon. All of this was the visible surface of the Duat, the outside of the place where the dead went, the starry skin of the goddess who held the sun inside her body throughout the night. The Egyptian sky was not empty. It was not simply the absence of ground. It was a country, an inhabited country, continuous with the country beneath the earth, where the dead were understood to dwell in their various estates, and the sun traveled its 12 sequential hours. The sky and the underground were one territory. Nut's body made them continuous. Her arching form, depicted on the ceilings of tombs and temples, as well as on the insides of coffin lids, was the connective tissue between the stellar and the chthonic versions of the same place. There is a painting in the tomb of Senenmut, a high official of the reign of Hatshepsut, whose tomb was cut into the hillside at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank, that shows the astronomical ceiling of his burial chamber. It depicts the northern and southern skies in careful diagrammatic form, with the circumpolar constellations arranged around the northern pole, and the decans, the star groups used by Egyptian astronomers to measure the hours of the night, arranged in the southern sky. The ceiling of the burial chamber is the sky. The sky is the Duat. The dead official lies beneath a painted map of the place he has gone, with the stars of his new country arranged above him in their proper positions, correctly labeled, their circuits exactly as they appear from the valley below on any cloudless night. A coffin, in this context, was a careful piece of cosmological engineering. Its exterior was the outer visible form of the dead person's body, often painted with protective texts and divine figures. Its interior was the Duat itself, the dark enclosed night, Nut's body, the star-covered darkness in which the sun traveled and the dead found their country. The person inside the coffin was surrounded on all sides by the underworld, below them the floor of the world, above them the arching body of the goddess of the sky, around them the walls of the narrow night through which they were passing. The coffin was not a container. It was, in the tradition's understanding, a world. In museums now, in Cairo and London and Paris and New York, and dozens of other cities far from the Nile Valley, Egyptian coffins rest in their cases with their lids open or removed, the interior surfaces visible. The painted body of Nut stretches across the inside of the lid, her dark form, her star-scattered skin, her hands and feet touching the corners. The pigments that painted her have held their color, in some cases for more than 3,000 years. The deep blue-black of her skin, the yellow of the stars, the fine lines of the hieroglyphic text that runs beside her, identifying her, naming her qualities, calling on her to receive the dead person within her arms. The painting is intact because it spent those 3,000 years in darkness. It was painted for the dark. It was made to be seen, if at all, by the light of a small oil lamp at the moment of closing the lid, by the priest or craftsman who made the last check before the coffin was sealed, and then not seen again. The Duat was where that painting went. Not lost, not destroyed, not faded by the sun, because there is no sun inside the Duat. Not directly, only the traveling solar bark moving through its sequential hours with its own contained light. The painting rested in the dark, inside the sealed coffin, inside the sealed tomb, inside the limestone cliff on the west bank of the Nile, for the full 3,000 years of its burial. Outside, above the cliff, the circumpolar stars made their slow circuits around the northern pole, visible every night from the valley floor, the imperishable ones turning without ceasing in the sky. That was also the Duat. That was also the interior of Nut's vast body. The sun went down every evening through the western horizon and began its 12-hour passage through the regions that the craftsman had mapped on the burial chamber walls. The dead lay in their coffins beneath the painted sky. Nut arched above them, her star-covered body, the ceiling of their world, her hands and feet touching the four corners, holding the whole night inside her frame. The night sky and the underworld were, in the understanding of the tradition, the same continuous and enclosing place. One seen from below, from the living world, in the slow turning of the imperishable stars above the desert. One inhabited from within by the dead and the traveling sun, moving through its sequential hours in the enclosed dark below the limestone cliffs. Nut's body made them one. Her arching form was the connection between the country of the dead and the sky. The living watched every night without quite knowing what they were looking at. The lit surface of a world they would one day enter, moving the same way the sun moved, through the same 12 hours of the same hidden land, toward the same eastern horizon and the same gradual opening into morning. The first pylon gate of the Book of Gates rises out of the dark in a specific way, not gradually, not as something that resolves slowly from shadow into shape, but all at once two massive stone uprights standing at full height, their surfaces carved with figures and texts and registers so fine they seem pressed into the limestone rather than cut from it. A serpent lies stretched across the lintel between them, its body at rest, its head raised at an angle that suggests attentiveness without aggression. On either side of the opening, at the base of each upright, stands an armed figure, not tall, not enormous, but entirely still in the way that stone figures are still, holding a long knife against its side, with the flat of the blade turned slightly outward, as though displaying rather than wielding it. The gateway between them is not lit. Whatever passes through it carries its own light, or none. The Book of Gates is the oldest sustained attempt to map this passage in architectural terms, where the Duat organizes the Duat's 12 regions as a sequence of horizontal corridors. The Book of Gates understands it as something more specific, a series of massive pylons, each one a complete structure in itself, each one presenting the same basic form, an outer entrance, a passage of some length, an inner gate, and above all of it the body of a serpent, whose name must be spoken correctly before the structure will consent to be moved through. The text was painted across the walls of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, its registers running in long horizontal bands from floor to ceiling, each gate given its own section of wall, each section rendered in the careful, cursive style of New Kingdom tomb painting. Figures in profile, bodies composed from their most recognizable angles, the whole thing drawn with a reed pen in lamplight by craftsmen who spent their working lives inside these corridors. 12 of these gates stand between the entry to the Duat and its deepest interior. 12. The number corresponds to the hours of the Egyptian night, so that each gate is also a passage of time, each threshold crossed, marking another hour completed in the long transit from sunset to sunrise. The gates do not blur into one another. Each one is individually named, individually staffed, individually characterized by the specific nature of its guardian serpent and the specific demands it makes of those approaching. This is the quality that distinguishes travel through the Duat from ordinary darkness. It is not featureless, it is precise. There is a gate with a specific name, guarded by a serpent with a different specific name, and behind that gate, another structure of the same basic type, with its own naming, its own staffing, its own distinct identity within the larger sequence. The guardian serpents of the gates bear names that function as compressed descriptions of what they represent. One is called something rendered approximately as he who burns. Another carries a name meaning the flaming one. A third holds a designation related to the idea of encircling or encoiling. These are not decorative epithets, but functional identifiers. The name tells the approaching soul what quality of power they are dealing with, what aspect of divine fire or divine boundary keeping this particular guardian embodies. In Egyptian understanding, a name was not separate from the thing it named. To know the true name of something was to know the thing itself at a level that gave the knower a form of standing before it. This is why the Duat required name knowledge as its currency of passage. Not offerings, not beauty, not the quality of the tomb built above. Names correctly recalled, correctly pronounced, spoken in the right order at the right moment. The mechanism of passage was specific. On approaching a gate, the traveler was required to speak three things: the name of the gate itself, the name of the guardian serpent, stretched across its lintel, and the particular password or identifying phrase that established the traveler as a soul that had been properly prepared and justly admitted to this journey. These were not improvised. They were provided in advance by the funerary texts prepared during the person's lifetime and placed in the tomb, or in the case of papyrus scrolls, made for individuals of sufficient means, written in the hand of a scribe, and sealed into the wrappings of the mummy itself. The Book of Going Forth by Day, which later scholarship would call the Book of the Dead, contained among its many chapters exactly this material: the names of the gates, the names their guardians bore, the words that would open each one. A person who had access to these texts went into death not unarmed, but precisely equipped. Someone who did not have them faced the same gates with the same requirements, and nothing to say. The armed sentinels flanking each gate are among the most frequently depicted figures in New Kingdom funerary art. In the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings, they appear in long rows along the corridor walls, their animal heads turned outward from the painted surface at an angle that gives them the quality of looking into the room rather than at it, looking specifically at whoever stands in the corridor before them. Seti I was the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, and his tomb is among the deepest and most elaborately decorated in the valley, its walls covered with nearly the complete corpus of funerary texts available in his period, rendered in a painted style of unusual delicacy, the pigments still holding much of their original saturation after 3,000 years of burial. The figures of the sentinels in that tomb have heads that include jackals, crocodiles, serpents rendered frontally, lions with mouths slightly open, rams with their horns sweeping backward, and forms that combine two or more of these into hybrids for which there is no simple description. Each one holds its knife. Each one stands at its assigned gate. Each one has a name. The animal heads of the gatekeepers are not arbitrary. In Egyptian theological thinking, specific animals carried specific divine properties, qualities of perception, movement, power, or transformation that made them appropriate vessels for particular aspects of divine function. The jackal was associated with the borderland between the living and the dead, with the desert margins where burials took place, with the careful and precise work of preservation. The crocodile carried associations with power and water, with the sudden and complete nature of certain kinds of transformation. The lion was connected to the horizon, the point of sunrise and sunset, and to the solar fire that moved through it. The ram was associated with the creative force latent in the sun during the night hours, which is why the sun god himself took ram-headed form while traveling through the Duat. Each guardian's animal head then locates it within a specific area of divine competence, tells the approaching soul something about what this gate represents within the larger sequence, what aspect of divine order it enforces. A jackal-headed sentinel stands at the passage of one of the middle gates, its long knife held against its thigh, its narrow black head turned at a slight angle toward the approaching soul. The posture is not one of raised alarm. It is the posture of a figure that has been standing here for a very long time, doing exactly this, waiting for the next arrival, preparing to hear whether the approaching soul will speak correctly or fall silent. If the soul speaks correctly, the sentinel steps aside, the knife stays at its side. The passage opens. If the soul cannot speak the names, the gate does not open. This is the whole of it. There is no wrestling with the guardian, no bargaining, no alternative route around the pylon. The gate simply remains closed. The soul waits or does not wait, in whatever sense those words apply to something that has arrived at this specific threshold without the names it needed. Among all the beings that inhabited the Duat, one occupied a particular position in relation to the gates and the solar journey moving through them. Apophis, the vast serpent of the deep, posed no challenge that could be met with names and passwords. Apophis was not a guardian. It was not a figure within the ordered structure of the gates. It was a force of opposition that pressed against the solar bark from outside the system, attempting not to bar passage, but to end it entirely, to stop the sun's movement through the night and prevent dawn from arriving. In the Book of Gates and the Duat, the response to Apophis was not a recitation of names, but a coordinated action. The crew of the solar bark, assisted by the gods stationed along the route, held the serpent bound with ropes, applied knives to its coils, and worked specific spells designed to reduce its power at the moments when its pressure on the bark was greatest. The text described this in practical terms as a set of procedures. There are chapters dedicated to it. The defeat of Apophis was not guaranteed by the structure of the gates, the way that passage through those gates was guaranteed by correct names. It was something that had to be actively maintained, hour by hour, at each point along the route where the serpent's opposition manifested. In the Duat, the text whose full name is roughly translated as "that which is in the Duat, the fourth and seventh hours of the night," are treated as the moments when Apophis posed its most acute challenge. The tomb of Thutmose, 3 in the Valley of the Kings, contains one of the earliest relatively complete versions of the Duat, painted on the walls of its oval burial chamber. in a style deliberately evocative of a rolled papyrus, the figures drawn in a reduced, almost diagrammatic manner, the outlines in dark paint against a cream-colored background, as though the entire room is a page from a divine handbook. In the registers covering those specific hours, Apophis appears as a body of enormous lateral extent, its coils filling the full height of the register and bending back on themselves at the margins of the painted space, surrounded by the smaller figures of the gods who work at binding it. The serpent in those paintings is not depicted as something that has been defeated, it is depicted as something that is being defeated. Right now, in this painting, at this hour, its subjugation ongoing, not achieved once, but maintained continuously. The difference between Apophis and the gate guardian serpents is worth holding clearly. The gate guardians are named, staffed, and in principle navigable. They are part of the architecture. Their function is discriminating. They admit the qualified and decline the unqualified, and a soul with the right preparation can pass them in sequence without incident. Apophis was not named in the sense that knowing its name gave power over it. It was named in the Egyptian sense that naming something acknowledged its reality, gave the priests a handle for the ritual procedures of binding and driving back. But Apophis could not be passed by recitation. It could only be held off hour by hour by the combined effort of divine beings working in coordination, using ropes and blades, and the specific power of spells composed for exactly this purpose. What that arrangement produced in the cosmological imagination of the Egyptians was something close to a picture of maintained order. The gates were there, and they were navigable. The route through the night was mapped, named, and equipable with the right preparation. The serpent of opposition was real, its pressure was real, and the measures taken against it were real, but they were also, in the tradition's account, effective. Dawn came every morning. The gates were traversed every night. The Duat functioned as a system, not because nothing threatened it, but because the threat was structural, and the response to it was equally structural, built into the same texts and the same paintings and the same sequence of preparations that equipped the deceased for their passage. The lion-headed gatekeepers are among the most visually specific figures in the entire funerary corpus. In certain tomb paintings, the lions are depicted with mouths open and fire issuing from them, painted in orange and yellow pigment, the flame rendered in a series of small curved marks that suggest something moving, something active, something generated by the creature's own nature rather than carried from outside. The orange of those marks has held its brightness across several thousand years. The fire the lion-headed figures breathe is not dimmed by the time that has passed since the pigment was laid. It still reads as fire, still reads as bright against the darker ground of the tomb wall, still performs exactly the function the craftsman who painted it intended, which was to make visible, in a specific and concrete way, the quality of illuminating and consuming power that these figures brought to their stations. Fire in the Duat had two related functions. It provided light in a place that had no sunlight during the hours when the sun was moving through it, and it consumed what needed to be consumed, specifically what had been condemned. The gatekeepers who bore fire did both at once. Their open mouths lit the gate passage and simultaneously marked the fate of what was not permitted through. This double function was not contradictory. The Egyptians understood fire as naturally both protective and destructive, with the distinction depending entirely on what the fire was directed toward. The same quality that made it dangerous made it useful. A fire that destroyed the enemies of the solar passage was, from the solar bark's perspective, a guardian. The gatekeepers with fire in their mouths were not ambiguous. They were precise instruments within a precise system, and the direction of their fire was as specific as the names on the gateposts. The corridors of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were not purely functional spaces. They were not blank passageways connecting the entrance to the burial chamber. They were themselves part of the underworld. They prepared the royal dead to enter their walls painted with the geography of the Duat, their lengths lined with the figures of its inhabitants, so that the physical act of moving from the tomb's entrance to its deepest chamber replicated in miniature the structure of the night journey. To walk the corridor of the tomb of Seti I, or Ramesses II, or Merempta, was to walk through a version of the Duat, compressed into limestone and oil lamp light. The gatekeepers present on both sides at full height, their animal heads turned outward at the standing angle that suggests they are oriented towards someone in the room. The tombs were closed after burial. The corridor was dark. The painted figures stood in their permanent stations along walls that no living person would see again for 3,000 years. And they stood there in exactly the same relationship to the empty corridor as they had been painted to stand in relationship to the preceding royal dead, watchful, still, each one in its assigned position, each one bearing its specific name. The names of the gatekeepers were not incidental. They were the substance of what made each figure distinct within a visual register where many of them shared basic formal similarities: a bipedal body, a weapon, an animal head, a specific station on a specific side of a specific gate. In a system organized around names, naming was itself a form of definition. To have a name was to be a being with a particular function in a particular place, distinguishable from all other beings with their own particular functions in their own particular places. The figure with the jackal head at the right side of the third gate was not interchangeable with the figure with the crocodile head at the left side of the seventh gate. They were different beings with different names, doing different work at different points in the sequence, or thanate, and the funerary texts carried both names, correctly assigned to their correct positions, because collapsing them into a single category of guardian would have made the texts useless for their purpose. The pylons themselves have a specific physical character worth dwelling on. A pylon in Egyptian temple and funerary architecture was a particular form, two tapering towers with sloping outer faces, joined by a lower gateway section between them, the whole structure presenting a broad, stable front to whoever approached it. The temples at Karnak and Luxor still have their pylons, or the ruins of them, standing at their entrances. The pylons of the Book of Gates take this form into the Duat and fill it with additional features: the serpent across the lintel, the sentinels at the base, the registrations of divine text carved into the sloping tower faces. They are monumental in the way that Egyptian monumental architecture is monumental, not baroque, not ornamented beyond their structural logic, but very large, very stable, and covered in writing that specifies exactly what they are and what they require. Standing before the first one in the lamplight of a painter's imagination, holding the text that gives its name, its serpent's name, and the words that would open it, there would be something almost procedural about the experience, not cold, but organized. The gate does not hate the approaching soul. It does not want to stop it. It wants to verify it, which is a different thing entirely. The gate is a mechanism of confirmation, not a barrier of hostility. The knife-bearing sentinels are not executioners waiting for an excuse. They are officials checking documentation in the form that documentation takes in a world organized around names and spoken knowledge. Pass the check, and they stand aside. This is the whole of their function. They perform it with complete attention and complete impartiality, and they have been performing it since the tradition first described them. The serpent across each gate's lintel participates in this logic of names differently from the sentinels. It is the gate's animating quality, the divine power that makes the pylon more than a large stone structure, the thing that gives it an active rather than a passive relationship to the souls that approach it. In Egyptian cosmological thinking, the serpent was associated with the creative and dangerous power at the boundary of structured order, the edge of the world, the primordial water, the moment before the universe organized itself into its current arrangement. Placed at the gates of the Duat, the serpent at each lintel marks those gates as true thresholds, not just architectural divisions between regions, but genuine boundaries between different qualities of the cosmic order, each gate admitting the soul one stage deeper into a realm that operated by increasingly interior rules. There is a specific painting in the tomb of Ramesses VI in the Valley of the Kings, on a wall of the corridor leading from the upper chambers toward the burial hall, where the gatekeeper figures are depicted at a scale large enough that their features are entirely legible from a standing position in the corridor. The lion-headed figure on the right side of one of the inner gate representations has its mouth open at an angle that makes the orange marks of fire painted inside it clearly visible. Not a suggestion of fire, but a specific rendering of it, careful enough that the individual marks of the reed pen are distinguishable in good light. The figure has been standing in that corridor, its mouth open with that painted fire, since approximately the 12th century before the Common Era. The fire has not gone out. The figure has not moved from its station. Its name is written in the hieroglyphic register above its head in the same reed pen hand that drew its body in its open mouth, and that name is as legible now as it was when the painter set down the brush and stepped back to check the alignment. This quality, the persistence of the figures at their stations, the names still attached to them, the specific animal forms still recognizable in their specific positions along the tomb corridors, is one of the more quietly striking features of Egyptian funerary art considered as a whole. The tradition made the duet's interior visible. It did not leave it as pure theology or pure abstraction. It put it on walls in pigment in the precise forms of named beings at named positions along a mapped sequence of gates, and those walls have persisted in the rock of the Valley of the Kings for 30 to 35 centuries, depending on the tomb. The gatekeepers depicted there are still doing, in their painted form, exactly what the funerary text described them as doing, standing at the gate, holding the knife, waiting for the name to be spoken. The passage through the sequence of 12 gates was, in the logic of the tradition, a transformation as much as a transit. Each gate crossed was another level of the Duat's interior reached. Another stratum of the underworld's architecture entered. The soul that emerged from the 12th gate was not in the same place as the soul that stood before the first pylon, in the same way that the traveler who has walked the full length of a very long valley is not in the same place as the traveler at its entrance. The gates were not merely obstacles removed one by one. They were markers of progress through a place with genuine depth, genuine interiority, genuine stages between its outer and inner regions. The 12-gate structure gave the Duat a topography of increasing inwardness, each gate leading not just forward, but in a sense the texts make explicit, deeper into the place where the sun's regeneration would occur, and where the ultimate questions about the quality of a soul's existence would be decided. The souls of the dead were not the only travelers who moved through the gate sequence. The solar bark, carrying Ra in his night form, traversed the same 12 regions, past the same gate structures, received or was challenged by the same guardian figures in each hour. The gates double function, serving both the souls of the dead on their individual passages and the cosmic solar journey on its nightly transit, is one of the more elegant features of the system. The same architecture served both purposes. The gate that admitted a justified soul also opened for the solar bark. The names required of the individual dead were not different in kind from the divine knowledge that allowed the sun's passage. The Duat was a single place that contained both kinds of traversal simultaneously, its gates as useful for the cosmic journey as for the personal one. What remains of this entire structure now is mostly what the tomb painters put on the walls: the gates in their painted form, the sentinels in their assigned positions, the serpents on the lintels, the orange marks of fire at the open mouths of the lion-headed figures. The papyrus texts that named the gates and provided the passwords have survived in variable condition, some complete or nearly so, others fragmentary, others known only from later copies made at points when the originals were already deteriorating. The Book of Gates exists in its most complete form across several royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, where the paintings have been protected by the specific conditions of the desert rock: low humidity, stable temperature, the absence of light for most of their existence. These are not ideal conditions in the abstract, but they have proven adequate for pigment on limestone over a period of time that is difficult to hold in mind. The gatekeeper figures in those tombs have been looked at by a continuous sequence of eyes: the craftsmen who painted them, the priests who closed the tombs, the tomb robbers who entered them in antiquity, the explorers and scholars who opened them again from the 19th century onward, the conservation specialists who work in them now, and the visitors who move through the corridors in organized groups following guides with lights. In all that time, the figures have not changed their postures. The animal heads are still turned outward at the same angle. The knives are still held at the same position against the same thighs. The names are still written in the same registers above the same heads. The fire is still painted in the open mouths. There is something about discovering, at some point in the process of learning about these figures, that every single one of them has a name, a specific individual recorded name written in hieroglyphic signs above its head, legible to anyone who can read that script, preserved in the painted registers of the tomb corridors as carefully as the name of the king the tomb was built for. Not gatekeeper in a generic sense, not guardian as a category applied to similar-looking figures with similar functions, a name, an individual name that distinguishes this particular jackal-headed figure at this particular gate from all the other jackal-headed figures at all the other gates, and from the crocodile-headed and lion-headed and serpent-headed figures at their own gates, each one named, each one assigned, each one still standing exactly where the system placed it. The last corridor of the tomb of Seti I, in the section of wall painted with the figures of the gatekeepers for the later hours of the night, runs for some distance at a slight downward angle before the burial chamber opens out at its end. The painted figures line both sides of that corridor at the height of a standing person, their heads at eye level if the corridor is approached without crouching, their animal faces turned outward in the posture of attentiveness that the painters gave them. They are in the dark now. The tomb is not open to visitors in the way that some of the other tombs in the valley are. The corridor is empty. The figures stand in a darkness that would have been familiar to them from the tradition that imagined them, the darkness of the Duat's interior hours, the darkness between one gate and the next, the darkness that the solar bark moved through on its way toward the point where Rot and Osiris would briefly become the same being, and the long turn toward morning would begin. They stand there with their names above their heads and their knives at their sides, watching the empty corridor, waiting for whatever comes next through the gate, exactly as they were painted to do. The crested ibis stands at the edge of a shallow waterway in the delta, its long legs dark against the pale silt, its body dark and iridescent, the elaborate plume of feathers at the back of its head trailing downward like a question barely formed. It is a real bird. It lived in the marshes of ancient Egypt, and it lives there still, or in the places those marshes used to be. The Egyptians watched it and chose it, of all the birds available to them, as the hieroglyphic sign for the most complete and luminous form the human soul could achieve after death. That choice says something worth sitting with for a moment. Not the eagle, not the falcon, not anything that carries obvious associations of height or power or the sun. The ibis, long-legged, deliberate, its movements careful and considered, its plume an elegant trailing signature in the air behind it. Whatever quality the Egyptians were pointing at when they named the transfigured dead, the ibis was the thing that made it visible on the page. The word was written with that ibis sign. It referred to the form the soul achieved when the process of death and transformation was complete, when the component aspects of a person's being had been successfully integrated into something unified, luminous, and lasting. The Egyptian understanding of the soul was not simple. Where a living person might be said to carry a ka, a kind of vital animating double that required nourishment and continued in the body's image, and a ba, something closer to the personality or individual character that could move and travel independently of the body after death. The aku was neither of these. It was what the successful merging of these aspects produced. The plural, aku, named the company of those transfigured dead who had passed through the underworld's processes and emerged on the other side of them intact. In the oldest layers of Egyptian belief, the aku were associated with a specific and observable part of the night sky, not the planets, not the moon, but the stars that never set. The circumpolar stars, the ones that rotate in slow arcs above the northern horizon without ever dipping below it, were called the imperishable ones. The Egyptians watched them on clear nights from the desert plateau and saw what they actually were, stars that never disappeared, never fell below the world's edge, always present above the north. The word for this quality of never setting was applied both to those stars and to the aku, the luminous dead who had achieved an equivalent permanence. To become an aku was, in some sense, to become like those stars, not to go out, not to be swallowed by the horizon or the earth, to continue turning quietly in the dark above everything, present across the whole width of the night. The ibis hieroglyph carried that meaning in compressed form, a single painted bird in the corner of a papyrus, and behind it the concept of a light that does not diminish. In the Duat's interior, those lights were everywhere, if one knew what to look for. The aku were not passive residents of the underworld. They had power and agency within it, the ability to move and act, the capacity to intercede on behalf of the living through prayers and ritual practice that the Egyptians maintained carefully. A household with venerated ancestors could call on those ancestors. The dead were not simply gone. They had become something else, something with its own particular capabilities, and those capabilities were understood as real and usable. Funerary literature from across the dynastic periods returns to this again and again. The transformed dead as a resource, as a presence, as a kind of distributed luminosity spread across the underworld's vast interior in the way the imperishable stars were spread across the northern sky. Nehebka, whose name means approximately he who harnesses the spirits, moves through the Duat in a form quite unlike the ibis. In papyrus illustrations, he is rendered as a giant serpent with two heads facing outward from a single body, his coiled form large enough, in some depictions, to encircle the solar bark once as a protective ring. His expression, insofar as a serpent's expression can be read, is calm and attendant. His posture is not aggressive. He is a provider, one of the beings in the Duatis understood as offering nourishment to the deceased rather than challenging them, part of a spectrum of serpentine power within the underworld that extended in the opposite direction toward Apophis, the great enemy of the sun. Nephqua sits at one end of that spectrum, a serpent in service of sustenance and protection, large and quiet, encircling the things that need to be enclosed. It is useful to hold Nephqua in mind when thinking about the serpent imagery that fills the Duat, because there is an enormous amount of it, and it does not all mean the same thing. Egyptian religious thought maintained a genuine and specific understanding of different serpent natures: the uraeus, the cobra that rears from the forehead of divine beings and pharaohs, carrying solar power and royal protection; Apophis, the world-threatening chaos serpent, and a whole range of named beings in between, each with its own character and function within the underworld's order. Nehebkau's two heads are not a sign of confusion or excess. They are a specific detail encoded with specific meaning, pointing at the particular quality of spiritual binding and sustaining that he represents. The Duat was full of things that looked strange and meant something precise. Along the corridor walls of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, in long registers that run from floor to ceiling, along entire passages, there are rows of uraeus serpents depicted in profile. Each one rises from a low base, its body coiled below it, its hood spread, its head alert. Each one has a small comma of orange paint at its open mouth, the indication of fire, the fire it perpetually produces in the darkness of the corridor. Row after row of them, identical in posture, each one a careful repetition of the one before, stretching down the painted walls toward the inner chambers. The effect is not violent. The overall impression is more like a corridor that has been carefully lit, the fire at each uraeus providing a form of illumination specific to the underworld, not sunlight, not lamplight, but the fire of the sacred cobra, maintaining its steady emission in the darkness for as long as the tomb remains sealed and the gods remain present within the painted world. Those corridors were understood as more than decoration. The tomb was not simply a record of the religious texts. It was an installation of those texts into a permanent architectural space. The figures on the wall held in a kind of active suspension, doing continuously what they were depicted doing. The uraeus serpents were not illustrations of fire-breathing cobras. They were fire-breathing cobras, perpetually present in their painted form, serving their function in the underworld as the text described. The tomb connected the physical burial chamber to the cosmological space of the Duat through the consistent installation of its imagery, the wall paintings making the two spaces continuous. A king who had been buried in the Valley of the Kings was not merely near paintings of the underworld. The tradition held that he was in the underworld, and the underworld was in the tomb, and the painted cobras were as real within that understanding as cobras have ever been anywhere. The fire those serpents produced served two purposes simultaneously, and the texts do not separate them. It provided light in a darkness that would otherwise be absolute, the functional, practical light needed to see by, in a region with no sun, and it provided the means by which those whose hearts had not been found true encountered the final consequence of that judgment. The Duat held both purposes in a single image without contradiction. The fire of the sacred cobra was both a lamp and a boundary, both illumination and a statement about what the underworld's order required. It is the second purpose that the texts name less often and spend less time with. The corridors of the great royal tombs were painted primarily for the blessed dead, for the Imaku, the venerated ones, the souls who had been found true and received what the tradition described as the full quality of afterlife the underworld offered. The Imaku. The word means something like the venerated, the provided for, the ones who are under the care and protection of the divine order. They were the justified dead, the souls whose hearts had been weighed and found in alignment with Maat, the principle of cosmic truth and order that the Egyptians understood as fundamental to the maintenance of the world. Being in a Maku was not a passive state. The texts describe it as an active and well-furnished existence, access to food and drink, to light, to the company of the gods, to a form of continued life within the underworld that was genuinely life and not simply the absence of the alternative. The contrast with the fate of those who had not been found true was drawn in funerary literature with a finality that leaves no middle ground. The Imaku had everything the underworld offered. The condemned had nothing or were destroyed entirely. The difference between these outcomes was absolute and permanent, and the tradition held it in those terms without qualification. But the weight of the funerary literature falls consistently on the Imaku, on what they have and what their existence contains. The field of reeds, Eru in the Egyptian tradition, the blessed realm that the righteous dead could inhabit, appears in Book of the Dead papyri as a landscape of extraordinary abundance and order. Tall grain on either side of flooded waterways, small boats on the canals, the blessed dead in white linen, performing the labor of plowing and harvesting, not as a punishment or a burden, but as the continuation of the life they had known. The agricultural rhythms of the Nile Valley extended into a domain where the harvest never failed, and the floods came at exactly the right time, and the grain stood always at its full height. The Egyptians knew the Nile's floods intimately, and knew how completely the quality of a year depended on their timing and their measure. To imagine a place where all of that uncertainty had been resolved, where the water always came right, where the grain was always tall, was to imagine the fullest version of what the Nile Valley at its best could be. One such scene survives in a papyrus now in museum collection, painted in the careful flat colors of the New Kingdom Egyptian palette. In that painting, an Amaku figure moves through the field of reeds with a plow, the grain tall and close on either side, a waterway visible behind the figure in the painting's middle register, with a small boat resting on the calm surface. The colors are muted but specific, the blue-green of the water, the yellow of the grain, the white of the figure's linen garments, the brown of the earth turned by the plow. Everything about the image is unhurried. The figure is not racing against a season. The grain is not in danger of failing. The boat is not going anywhere in particular. It is a scene of contentment, rendered in the visual vocabulary the tradition had available for it, and it communicates its content precisely, an Amaku in a good place, with all the time in existence to continue doing exactly what they are doing. The 42 assessors of the Hall of Two Truths, the divine judges before whom the deceased stood to make the negative confession, are among the Duat's most carefully enumerated inhabitants. Each of the 42 presides over a specific sin or transgression, a particular category of wrongdoing, and each is also associated with a specific place in Egypt. The negative confession, sometimes called the Declaration of Innocence, required the deceased to address each of the 42 individually, denying the specific transgression each one oversaw. It was not a general statement of having been a good person. It was a specific line-by-line accounting delivered to each assessor in turn, covering a range of conduct that included violence, deceit, theft, eavesdropping, speaking angry words without cause, and disturbing the offerings of the gods. The specificity is remarkable. The tradition did not trust a general claim of virtue. It asked for a denial of each particular failure before each particular judge. In Book of the Dead vignettes depicting this scene, the 42 assessors are arranged in 2 long rows within the hall, sometimes seated, sometimes standing, each one bearing a distinct head that encodes its particular divine nature or function. The deceased figure stands at one end of the hall in white linen, small against the length of the ranked judges. The scene does not read as a trial in the modern adversarial sense. It reads more like a formal inventory, each item on the list addressed in order, the full catalog of possible failures moved through without skipping anything, the procedure thorough because the tradition understood thoroughness as one of the qualities that made the judgment fair. The 42 were not trying to catch the deceased out. They were the structure within which the deceased could demonstrate what their life had actually contained. The boss of a dead person could move. That is one of the qualities that distinguished it from the K, which was more fixed and required the physical presence of the body or its image. The Ba, depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird, could travel between the underworld and the upperworld, could leave the tomb, could return to familiar places. This mobility is depicted in tomb paintings and described in funerary texts as one of the faculties the deceased retained and could exercise, the capacity to move through registers of existence that the living could not enter, to visit the places of the living world while remaining fundamentally among the dead. The Bob of an Imaku who had been found true had this freedom available. The painted human-headed birds that appear in tomb imagery, hovering near the mummy or descending into the tomb shaft, are its visual form, a bird that is also a person, moving through the air with the easy capability of both. The Duat's population was not arranged in a flat democracy of the dead. Its inhabitants occupied different registers of existence with different qualities and different degrees of agency, and the tradition held those distinctions with precision. The Ak was the most complete form, the fully integrated luminous soul. The Bay-Ak was a component aspect with its own mobility and independence. The Ka was the vital double, the animating presence that required nourishment from offerings left at the tomb. The Imaku were defined by their relationship to divine favor and the quality of existence it granted. And across all of these categories, the divine beings of the Duat moved in their own registers, the gods who staffed the gates, the gods who worked the scales of judgment, the gods who navigated the solar bark through the 12 hours, and the smaller divine figures who served specific functions in specific regions without having the comprehensive presence of the major deities. Within that populated world, Nepheb-Kau continues his slow movement through the Duat's waterways, his two-headed form steady and unhurried. In some texts, he is described as offering sustenance directly to the deceased, providing the nourishment that the underworld required for those who had not yet received the field of reeds, or supplementing what the tomb offerings provided. The tradition held that the dead required feeding, that their continued existence in the Duat depended partly on the offerings made by the living above, and partly on the provision of beings like Nepheb-Kau within the underworld itself. The two-headed serpent was part of a system of sustenance spread across the whole Duat, a system that the priests and funerary specialists worked to maintain through ritual, because the dead were real presences with real needs. and the failure of those needs would have consequences that moved in both directions. It is worth pausing on the specificity of Nephebkau's form. 2 heads on a single serpentine body. The Egyptian tradition was not careless about such details. Every hybrid form, every unusual combination of parts, encoded meaning that the tradition held in stable, transmissible form across the centuries. 2 heads facing outward from a single body suggests something about the nature of spiritual binding, the capacity to hold 2 things together, or to face 2 directions simultaneously, or to gather what is dispersed and hold it in a single organism. He who harnesses the spirits. The name suggests the gathering of the Aku, perhaps the function of binding the transfigured dead to the protective system of the underworld, rather than letting them disperse into the darkness. Whatever the specific interpretation, the form was chosen deliberately, and its deliberateness is itself a quality worth noticing, the evidence of a tradition that had thought at length about what it was depicting and had specific reasons for every choice it made. The halls and corridors of the Duat were not only populated by the resident divine beings and the passing dead, they contained specialized groups of beings whose function was particular and whose existence was defined entirely by what they did in the specific region of the underworld they inhabited. Some were named in texts that list them carefully, giving each one an individual identity within the larger system. The practice of naming, of identifying each being in the Duat individually, assigning a name to each guardian, each gate, each region, was not merely administrative. In Egyptian belief, to know the name of a being was to have a specific form of power in relation to it. The deceased moved through the Duat in possession of lists of names, precisely because those names were functional. Speaking them correctly was what opened gates and satisfied sentinels and allowed passage from one region to the next. The company of the Aku, meanwhile, occupied their own particular spaces within the Duat. The field of reeds was one destination, but the texts describe other regions accessible to the justified dead, other places within the underworld's geography, where the blessed could exist with different qualities of experience. Some of these regions are described as lit by a sustained divine radiance, different from ordinary sunlight, the light that the Aku themselves contributed. Their luminous nature, adding to the illumination of the underworld's interior in the way that the stars contribute to the light of the night sky. The association between the Aku and the imperishable stars ran both directions. The stars had the quality of the transfigured dead, permanent, luminous, unceasing. The transfigured dead had the quality of the stars. Their light did not go out. The 2 things reflected and reinforced each other across the full breadth of the Egyptian cosmological system. That system was large and carefully maintained. The priests who administered the temple complexes, the scribes who copied the funerary texts, the artisans who painted the tomb walls, the embalmers who prepared the bodies, all of these people were participating in the maintenance of a cosmological order that required sustained attention and effort to keep functional. The Duat was not merely a mythological space existing in texts and paintings. It was a real location within the Egyptian universe, a place where real things happened that had real consequences for the living world above. The properly maintained dead were an active component of the living world's continued operation. The Aku in their luminous company in the underworld were part of the same system as the priests in their temple, the Nile in its annual cycle, the sun in its nightly passage through the 12 hours. Everything was connected. Everything required maintenance. Everything depended on the proper execution of the roles and functions the tradition had assigned. The crested ibis standing at the edge of its shallow waterway does not know it is a hieroglyph. It is simply a bird doing what ibises do, moving carefully through the water, its long legs navigating the silt with practiced attention, its plume trailing behind it in the warm air. The Egyptians who chose it as the written sign for the Ankh were watching the same bird with the same care and finding in it something that made the concept legible, something that the ibis's particular quality of movement and presence communicated better than any other available image. The Ankh was luminous. The Ankh was transfigured. The Ankh was the complete and integrated soul that had passed through the full process of death and emerged from it, not diminished, but changed into something more coherent and more lasting than what it had been before. And the ibis, with its careful movement and its trailing plume and its long-legged deliberateness in the shallow water, was what the Egyptians reached for when they needed to write that down. The 42 assessors do not speak among themselves while they wait. In the painted vignettes, they are arranged in their 2 long rows, with the stillness of beings who have been waiting for a very long time and are entirely accustomed to it. Each one is distinct, different head, different animal form encoding a different divine quality, different specific domain of judgment for which it is responsible. They are assembled within the hall's columned space with the order and precision of a formal institution, which is exactly what the tradition understood them to be. The Hall of Two Truths was not improvised. It was not casual. It was the most precisely organized and most carefully administered room in the entire Duat, and the assessors were its permanent staff, present for every judgment, their presence constituting the authority within which the scales could be read as fair, and the verdict could be accepted as final. Beyond the hall, deeper in the Duat, or simply in a different register of the same vast space, the field of reeds extends across whatever distance it extends across, in a tradition that did not worry about reconciling the literal dimensions of the painted papyrus with the literal dimensions of the cosmos. The Imaku move through it in white linen with their plows and their small boats, the grain tall and yellow on either side of the flooded fields, the waterways calm and clearly defined, the whole scene lit by a light that is neither daylight nor lamplight, but the particular illumination of the blessed dead's country. In the papyrus painting, the figure at the plow has the posture of someone thoroughly absorbed in what they are doing, not performing labor for an observer, but simply plowing. The plow moving through the earth at the angle the farmer has always known was right, the furrow straight and clean behind it. The Imaku in their luminous form, the Imaku in their well-furnished existence, the Nehebkau in his slow protective coils around the solar bark, the 42 assessors at their permanent stations in the Hall of Two Truths, the rows of urea serpents maintaining their steady fire along the painted corridors, the babs moving between the worlds with the easy flight of a human-headed bird. These were the population of the Duat as the tradition understood and described it. Not an empty darkness, not an undifferentiated void, a densely inhabited and carefully ordered interior world, every being within it assigned a name and a function and a place in the larger system that the whole underworld constituted. The tradition spent enormous energy on this population precisely because it mattered, because the Duat was real and its inhabitants were real, and their existence had consequences that extended upward into the living world and into the night sky and into the steady turning of the imperishable stars above the desert. The ibis-headed Thoth, who belongs more fully to the Hall of Two Truths than to this wider survey of the Duat's inhabitants, was still the god who moved between all of these regions, his scribal palette and his long pen available for any recording the underworld required. Divine record keeping in the Egyptian tradition was not a secondary activity, it was primary. The world was maintained through accurate documentation, through the names correctly inscribed, the judgments correctly recorded, the texts copied without error across the generations. Thoth was the principle of that documentation, given a divine body and a specific form. His ibis head connected him visually to the written sign for the Akh, both ibis-shaped, both associated with a form of luminous precision that the tradition valued above most other qualities it could name. In the tomb of Seti I, the wall paintings of the corridor register show the Uraeus serpents in their long row with a clarity and brightness that have survived 3,000 years of underground stillness. The orange paint at each open mouth still reads as fire. The hoods still read as spread and alert. The scale of the row is what stays with a viewer, the sheer number of them, the identical posture repeated without variation down the length of the wall, the cumulative effect of that repetition producing something more than the sum of its individual painted cobras. A corridor of fire, a corridor of presence, a statement about the nature of the underworld's boundaries and the nature of the beings that maintain them, made in paint on limestone and left in place to do its work in the sealed dark of the tomb, for as long as the stone held. The Duat held all of these things simultaneously, the luminous Ugg, the guarding Uraeus, the abundant field of reeds, and the Hall of Two Truths with its 42 carefully ranked judges, the slow protective coils of Nehebkau, and the small mobile ball making its way between the living world and the underworld with the habitual ease of something that had always moved in both directions. The tradition did not require these different registers of existence to be reconciled into a single consistent map. They were all true at once, all present within the same vast interior space, each one describing a different facet of what the underworld contained and what it meant for the dead to exist within it. The figure in the papyrus painting continues to plow. The imaku in white linen moves the plow through the dark soil of the field of reeds. The grain stands tall and yellow and close on either side. The waterway behind them holds its small boat in the reflection of whatever light the field is lit by. There is no hurry in the scene. The tradition that produced it was describing a form of continued existence, defined above all by its freedom from the particular pressures that make the living world demanding: the uncertain flood, the failed harvest, the shortened season. The field of reeds was not an escape from agricultural labor, but its perfection, the same plowing and harvesting the imaku had known in life, extended into a domain where the conditions were always right, and the work was never lost, and the grain grew as tall as grain could grow. The figure at the plow has all the time in existence to finish what it is doing, and the painting knows it and rests in that knowledge with a stillness that 3,000 years of museum display have not reduced at all. The hall is long. That is the first thing the image in the papyrus of Annie communicates, not its strangeness, not its solemnity, but simply its length. The painted room stretches from one edge of the papyrus to the other, a columned corridor rendered in the fine, unhurried lines of a New Kingdom scribe working sometime in the 13th century, before the Common Era, and its proportions are those of a space that takes time to cross. At the far end, on a white throne raised on a stepped dais, sits Osiris. At the near end, where the corridor begins, a door stands open. Between these 2 points, the hall holds everything the tradition placed inside it: the scales, the assessors, the divine witnesses, the scribal god with his palette and his pen, all arranged with the precision of a room that has been laid out, not once, but 1,000 times, in tomb after tomb, on papyrus after papyrus, because the Egyptians understood that this room was real and that everyone who had ever died in one way or another stood in it. The hall's name in the Egyptian texts is the Mati, the Hall of Two Truths, and the two truths it holds are not abstractions, they are the feather and the heart. One of them belongs to the goddess Mat, the principle of rightness and cosmic order, whose emblem was the ostrich feather she wore on her head, a single feather so specific in its proportions that the Egyptians used it as a hieroglyphic sign for the concept of truth itself. The other belongs to whoever has just arrived at the hall's threshold, a heart that has been beating and remembering and choosing since the moment its owner drew their first breath, and that now, according to the tradition, holds within it the entire and irreversible record of a life. The meeting of these two objects, feather and heart, on the pans of a balance, was the central event of the Egyptian understanding of death. Nothing in the Duat carried more weight than this single act of measurement. The hall sits deep within the Duat's interior. Multiple outer regions have been crossed before this threshold is reached. Corridors, waterways, guarded gates with their named sentinels standing in profile against painted stone, and by the time the hall comes into view, the Duat's earlier territories have already done their work of transition, of gradual removal from the living world. The hall is not the beginning of the underworld journey. It is closer to its center, the place toward which all the prior passages have been moving without announcing their destination. When the door opens and the room opens beyond it, the scale of the space is the first legible fact. The long perspective of the painted hall in the papyrus of Ani gives that distance its visual form. Osiris at one end, the arriving soul at the other, and between them the ranked rows of the 42 assessors seated or standing along both sides of the space, each one specific in form, each one bearing a distinct animal or hybrid head turned toward the center of the room. The assessors are 42 in number because the tradition understood Egypt as a land of 42 administrative regions, each with its own particular character and its own divine claim on moral accountability. Each assessor presides over a specific kind of transgression, and each is associated with a particular place in Egypt, a nome, a city, a district with its own name and its own qualities. The negative confession, the formal declaration the deceased made upon entering the hall, addressed each of these figures in turn, and its structure was that of a denial. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not caused suffering. I have not spoken against the gods. The list continues for 42 statements, each directed at a specific assessor with a specific name and a specific jurisdiction, and the formality of the recitation was not mere ritual performance. In the Egyptian understanding, a statement made correctly before the divine witnesses of the hall had the force of truth in the very act of its utterance. The declaration was not describing the life, it was submitting it. In the papyrus of Ani, the assessors are arranged in 2 long rows, one along each side of the hall, and the painter has given each of them just enough individual detail to establish that they are not the same figure repeated. A lion head here, a falcon head there, a head combining features that belong to no single living creature, a form that the tradition held as divine, and whose appearance in the painted hall confirmed that the hall was real and its proceedings legitimate. They sit or stand with the formal composure of beings who have been in this room for a very long time and will be here for a very long time after any particular judgment concludes. Their presence lines the approach to the scales. Their presence will line the departure from them, whatever the outcome of the weighing. The scales stand at the center of the hall, In the tradition's depictions, the balance is a straightforward instrument, a wooden beam supported at its midpoint on a vertical post, two pans hanging from each end by cords of equal length, the whole structure immediately recognizable as the kind of scale used in Egyptian markets for weighing grain, metals, and goods. The tradition took a common object and placed it at the center of its understanding of death, and in doing so made the judgment feel measurable, factual, precise, rather than arbitrary. The feather of Ma'at sits in one pan. In the other pan sits the heart. The feather is an ostrich feather, long-spined, evenly barbed, symmetrical, light to an almost paradoxical degree, given the significance of what it represents. The heart sits across from it in its own pan, like a small, dense, reddish-brown weight. The whole drama of the judgment lives in that image: two pans, two objects, one balance, and the question of which way the beam will tilt. In the Egyptian understanding, the heart was the seat of consciousness, memory, and moral agency, not a metaphor for these things, but their literal physical location. When a person remembered something, the heart was where the memory was stored. When a person made a choice, the heart was where the choice was formed. When a person died, everything they had ever done, or said, or thought, or refused to do was held inside the heart as a kind of accumulated record, the complete and exact texture of a life. Placing it on the scales opposite the feather of Ma'at was not symbolic. It was a weighing of a specific individual's history against the standard of cosmic rightness, and the balance either found them true or found them wanting, and there was no approximation in the measurement and no possibility of appeal. Anubis stood at the balance. The jackal-headed god of embalming was not only the god who presided over the physical preparation of the dead body for burial. In the tradition's account of the Hall of Two Truths, Anubis served as the divine overseer of the weighing itself, the figure who conducted the deceased into the hall and who stood at the scales to verify the accuracy of the measurement. In the Papyrus of Ani, he is depicted reaching toward the balance pointer with one hand extended, his jackal head angled slightly downward toward the beam, his posture that of a technician who knows this instrument very well and checks it with the habitual care of someone who has performed this task without error, a very large number of times. There is nothing anxious in his posture. There is nothing tentative. He approaches the balance with the settled attention of a craftsman at a familiar tool, and the effect of his depicted presence in the hall is one of competence rather than menace. The sense that the most important measurement in the underworld is in the hands of someone who is extremely good at taking it. Anubis appears throughout the funerary traditions of ancient Egypt in multiple roles, all of them connected to the intersection of the living and the dead, the body and its passage through transformation. He guided the dead through the outer regions of the Duat. He was associated with the wrappings and rituals of mummification. He was understood as the one who opened the way between worlds. In the hall, these various functions converge. The guide has guided the deceased to their destination, and now the embalmer, the one who has experience with what the body holds and what transformation requires, stands at the balance to witness the most important moment in his charge's passage. His presence is not incidental. He is the hall's most active human-scaled figure, the one who reaches, checks, verifies, who places himself between the deceased and the outcome of the weighing, and ensures that the measurement is correct. Thoth stood beside the scales with his palette. The ibis-headed god of writing and record-keeping, Thoth was the Duat's designated scribe, the divine keeper of knowledge, whose presence in the hall served the function that a court recorder serves in any proceeding requiring a permanent and accurate account. His tool was the scribal palette, a long wooden board with two circular wells for black and red ink, a slot along one edge holding the reed pens. The whole thing is familiar and specific as any craftsman's instrument. In the vignettes of the Book of the Dead, Thoth is depicted with his ibis head tilted slightly forward, his pen moving across a papyrus or a writing board, the tip of the reed in motion as the outcome of the weighing is committed to the record. He is not a passive witness. He is the one who makes the judgment permanent. The ibis was the bird the Egyptians chose to embody Thoth, and the choice carries its own precision. The sacred ibis was a common presence in the Nile Valley, a tall, long-billed wading bird that moved through the shallow water with a particular searching deliberateness, probing the silt with its curved bill, finding what was concealed beneath the surface. The Egyptians saw in that quality of careful, systematic search something that matched what Thoth did with knowledge. He did not guess, he did not estimate, he found exactly what was there. In the Hall of Two Truths, that quality becomes the guarantee of the record, not that the scribal god favors anyone, but that what he writes is what actually happened on the balance, and what he writes will stand. In some versions of the tradition, Thoth's role in the hall extended beyond record-keeping into something closer to advocacy. In certain papyri, after the weighing has concluded favorably, Thoth is depicted announcing the result to the assembled gods and to Osiris on his throne, speaking the deceased's vindication into the official record of the divine court, turning the finding of the scales into a spoken declaration with the full authority of the hall's divine quorum behind it. The Egyptian word for this vindication was makaru, meaning roughly true of voice, and it was one of the most important designations a dead person could receive. To be makaru was to have been heard, assessed, and found true by the gods of the Duat themselves, and the one who spoke that declaration first, in many accounts, was the ibis-headed scribe standing at his pallet beside the balance with his pen in hand. Osiris presided over everything. The god of the underworld and of resurrection sat at the hall's far end on a white throne beneath a canopy, his mummiform body wrapped in white linen, his crook and flail crossed against his chest in the standard posture of the reigning god of the Duat. His skin in the papyrus of Ani is painted a deep green, the color of the Nile's muddy banks, the color of new growth along the water's edge, the color of something that has been buried and come back, and against the white of his wrappings and the formal geometry of his throne, and the green of his skin is the most immediately mythological thing in the room. It announces in a single visual fact that this is the god who died and returned, and that his authority in this hall over those who have also died rests precisely on that experience. Osiris's mythology is one of the oldest continuously developed narratives in the Egyptian tradition. Murdered by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered across the land, he was gathered and restored by his consort Isis and his brother Nephthys, and the restoration was not complete enough to return him to life in the world of the living. What it produced was something different, something that held his identity and his power while belonging permanently to a different state of existence. He became the king of the dead, the ruler of the Duat, the god who proved by his own history that death was not the end of the person, but a transformation of it. His presence in the Hall of Two Truths carries all of that precedent. He is not an external judge, pronouncing on others from a position of ignorance. He is the one who has been through the thing that every soul in this hall has been through, and who sits at the far end of the room as evidence that the passage leads somewhere. The hall in the papyrus of Ani holds all of these figures simultaneously, and the painted composition distributes them with the careful spatial logic of a tradition that had been thinking about this room for a very long time. Osiris at the far end, the scales at the center, Anubis at the scales, Thoth beside them, the 42 assessors ranked along both sides of the space, and at the threshold, the newly arrived soul in the papyrus of the scribe Ani, the figure of Ani himself and his wife Tutu, painted in white linen, their posture the formal posture of supplication and attendance rather than fear. The composition is not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It is organized. It has the quality of something that has been arranged to be as fair as possible. The accused can see everything. The witnesses can see everything. The record keeper is present. The overseer is experienced. The presiding authority has personal knowledge of the condition being judged. The balance holds when the heart is true. This is the hall's central promise. Not that every heart will be found light, but that the measurement is exact and cannot be falsified, and that a heart equal in weight to the feather of Ma'at will be equal in weight to the feather of Ma'at will be equal in weight to the feather of Ma'at, regardless of who the person was in life, or what they owned, or who they knew. The tradition is quite clear on this point. The scales do not favor the wealthy or the powerful. A high official of the pharaoh's court and a potter's assistant from a village in Upper Egypt stand before the same balance with the same feather in the opposite pan, and what the balance finds is what it finds. The texts contain spells directed at the heart itself, instructions addressed to the heart, asking it not to testify against its owner, not to speak of what it witnessed, not to tip the balance with the weight of remembered transgressions. The very existence of these spells is interesting. They acknowledge that the heart carries a complete and honest record of the life, and that the record will be read by the balance in ways the deceased cannot control. The spells are a kind of negotiation, a request addressed to the heart to keep its own counsel in the hall, to rest quietly in the pan, rather than pressing its full testimony into the measurement. Whether the tradition believed these spells reliably worked is a different question from whether it considered them worth attempting. The spells exist because the examination was understood as real, the record as genuine, and the heart as the one entity in the proceeding that had no reason to frame anything in the best possible light. And there is a stillness in the hall that the papyrus compositions communicate without intending to, simply as a consequence of how they are drawn. The figures in the Book of the Dead vignettes do not move. They are caught in the postures of their functions, Anubis extending his hand toward the balance, Thoth's pen beginning its stroke, the assessors ranked in their long rows, and the painting medium holds them there permanently, in a moment that is always about to resolve into outcome, without ever quite resolving. The balance is always poised. The feather is always exactly as light as it is. The heart is always waiting for the beam to find its level. The scribe's pen is always beginning the record of a verdict that the viewer of the papyrus can never quite read, because the image holds the moment before the last stroke is completed and the result is committed to the permanent account. Amit waited beside the scales. At the base of the balance in the papyrus of Ani, a creature crouches in the composed, patient posture of a large animal at rest. Its hindquarters are those of a hippopotamus, broad and heavy, settled firmly against the painted ground. Its forequarters are those of a lion, the forepaws resting with the comfortable authority of a cat at ease. Its head is the head of a crocodile, long-jawed and narrow-eyed, the snout pointing in the direction of the scales above it, with an attention that is not agitated, but simply consistent. The way a large animal watches a process it has been watching for a long time, and has no reason to believe will differ from the last time. This creature is Amit, and her function in the hall is specific and structural. She is the consequence of an unfavorable judgment, the form that the tradition gave to the permanent end of an individual existence. The tradition's name for what Amit did was the second death. A body that died had its own set of ritual requirements and its own form of continuation beyond the physical. A heart that failed the balance met a different end, not further transformation, not a different kind of afterlife, but the consumption of the individual's remaining existence by Amit, so that nothing was left to continue. The Egyptian tradition understood this not as punishment in the punitive sense, but as a logical consequence of the Wang's finding. A heart that was not equal to the feather of Ma'at was a heart that did not contain the qualities that the continued existence of a person in the divine order would require. The second death was, in this reading, not vengeance but completion. The balance had found its answer, and Amit's waiting presence at the base of the scales was the visible form of that answer, when the answer went one way rather than the other. In the Papyrus of Ani, Amit is drawn with the same careful specificity as every other figure in the hall. She is not monstrously large. She does not dominate the composition. She occupies the lower portion of the vignette at the base of the balance's post, her crocodile jaw resting on her lion forepaws with the settled weight of something that does not need to announce itself. Her hippopotamus haunches are behind her. Her eyes are directed toward the balance with the calm, steady attention of a creature that has a defined purpose and is performing it without agitation. She is, in the composition's visual logic, one part of the hall's design, as the scales are a part of it, as the assessors are a part of it, as Osiris's white throne is a part of it. The hall does not function without her presence any more than it functions without Thoth's palette or Anubis's careful hand at the pointer. She is the fourth wall of a room that requires four walls to be a room. The combining of the crocodile, the lion, and the hippopotamus was not accidental in its selection. All three were among the most dangerous animals known to Egyptians from direct experience: the crocodile in the Nile, the lion on the desert's edge, the hippopotamus in the river shallows, and each carried its own long history of divine association in the Egyptian tradition. Amit drew from all three without belonging fully to any of them, and the combination produced a figure that was immediately identifiable as something outside the normal categories of animal life. She was not a natural creature. She was a made one, assembled specifically for the function she performed, given exactly the form her purpose required, and depicted with the composed precision of something that had been precisely engineered. The outcome of a favorable judgment was not simply relief or continuation. The tradition describes it as a specific entrance into a specific condition, the deceased, declared Makuru by Thoth and accepted by Osiris, passed through the hall's far end into the company of the gods and the justified dead. The field of reeds waited beyond the hall, the Aru, a flooded agricultural landscape of familiar Egyptian beauty, its grain tall and its waterways navigable, and its light the permanent, unhurried light of a world where the conditions that made the living world anxious no longer applied. The Imaku, the venerated dead, who had passed the hall's judgment and entered this condition, were described in the tradition as having access to food, to light, to the company of the divine, to all the forms of nourishment that sustained life in the world they had left. The hall was not the end of the path. It was the passage between a path and a destination. This is what the long painted room in the Papyrus of Ani was designed to convey: not a threat, but a structure; not an ordeal whose outcome was fundamentally uncertain, but a procedure that had been worked out with great care and was being administered with great precision by beings who knew exactly what they were doing. Osiris had knowledge of the condition being judged. Anubis had knowledge of the instrument measuring it. Thoth had knowledge of every word spoken in the hall and every movement of the balance, and would record it all without error and without omission. The 42 assessors had knowledge of their particular domains and were present as witnesses to the declaration made to each of them in turn. The hall was not a place of arbitrary power. It was a place of extraordinary organization, the most carefully designed room in a very large and very carefully designed world. The tradition held this room in particular esteem. Of all the spaces in the Duat described in the funerary texts, the guarded corridors, the waterways, and the vast sandy plains of the middle hours, the caverns and fire lakes of the deeper regions, the Hall of Two Truths received perhaps the most consistent and detailed visual attention across the widest range of sources. It appears in the Book of the Dead in version after version, its core composition stable across centuries of transmission, the long hall, the scales at center, Osiris enthroned, Anubis at the pointer, Thoth at his pallet, Ammit at her post, the assessors in their rows. Individual papyri differ in minor details, the exact arrangement of subsidiary figures, the specific rendering of Ammit's proportions, the number of columns depicted along the hall's sides. But the central composition persists because it was understood as a documentary record rather than an artistic convention. The Papyrus of Ani depicts a real place. The scale is a real scale. The feather is a real feather. The scribes who painted these papyri by lamplight in their workshops were not illustrating a metaphor. They were mapping a room. The Papyrus of Ani is now held in the British Museum in London, removed from Egypt in the 19th century, and now one of the most studied documents in the history of Egyptology. The papyrus is approximately 24 meters long, painted in warm, clear pigments, ochre and white, and Egyptian blue, and the malachite green of Osiris's skin that have maintained their color with an unexpected fidelity across the 3,000 years since they were first applied. The hall, as Annie's scribes painted it, is still legible in every detail. The columns, the canopy above Osiris, the two pans of the balance at precisely the same level, the fine line of the balance's pointer, Ammit's crocodile jaw resting on her forepaws, Thoth's pen beginning its stroke. The room that the tradition understood as real looks, in this painting, exactly as described. It has the quality of a place the painter had studied carefully, from sources that were themselves copies of sources that were themselves copies of sources going back to the moment when the tradition first settled on this room as the hinge of its understanding of what death meant and what came after it. The hall is long. It is organized. It contains within it the central instruments of an accounting that the tradition understood as the most precise and most consequential measurement ever performed, carried out by a jackal-headed god who has taken this measurement more times than the tradition counts, recorded by an ibis-headed scribe whose pen has never erred, witnessed by 42 divine assessors who have been present in this room since the order of the world was established, and presided over by a god whose authority rests on the knowledge of what the judgment is measuring, because he has been through it himself. The balance in the center of the room holds the feather. The feather is as light as it has always been, and the pen moves across the papyrus in Thoth's careful, unhurried hand, completing the last line of the record in the precise and fully legible script of the divine scribe, writing what the balance found, as it has written what every balance in this hall has found since the hall was first established at the center of the night, the record complete, the verdict held, the accounting the most fairly kept in any world the tradition ever described. On the western wall of the burial chamber of Thutmose III, in the Valley of the Kings, the artists who prepared that tomb for their pharaoh painted the Duat in a particular way. They rendered it not in the elaborate full-color style of later royal tombs, but in something closer to the look of a papyrus, cursive figures in black outline against a pale ground, the whole chamber made to resemble an unrolled scroll, as though the king were being buried inside the book itself. Among those figures, in the first register of the first hour, the Mesektet bark appears. Its prow curves upward and back in the high, elegant arc of an Egyptian river vessel built for ceremony rather than cargo. Its stern mirrors the same curve at the other end. Between them, on the deck, a central shrine sits closed around the figure of the sun god, resting inside it. He is shown in his ram-headed form, the aged, withdrawn aspect of Ra that belongs to night, the solar power that has turned away from the world for a time and drawn itself inward. The crew arranged around the shrine are small and purposeful. They stand at their stations. They hold their implements. The bark is moving. It is always in every hour of every depiction moving. That painted image on ancient limestone is where the night journey begins. Not at the moment of sunset, not at the western horizon where the world of the living ends and the duet begins, but here already in the first hour, already inside the first corridor, the bark already on the dark waterway that carries the sun through the body of the night. The Egyptians called this vessel the Mesektet, the night bark, and distinguished it from the Manjet, the day bark that carried the sun across the open sky from east to west in the hours of light. The Mesektet was a different kind of vessel for a different kind of passage. Where the Manjet crossed open sky, the Mesektet moved through enclosed corridors. Where the Manjet traveled in visibility, the Mesektet traveled in the particular darkness of the Duat, which is not the same as ordinary night, but a deeper condition, the darkness inside the world rather than the darkness above it. The crew of the Mesektet was not incidental. Each figure standing on that painted deck served a specific function that the night journey required, and the tradition named each one with care. Sia stood at the prow. Sia was the personification of divine perception, not sight exactly, not ordinary sensory awareness, but the deeper faculty by which the divine order apprehended itself, the capacity to know the road ahead without needing it to be illuminated. On the painted walls, Sia is shown leaning slightly forward over the dark water, eyes open, oriented toward whatever comes next. In the absolute darkness of the middle hours of the Duat, when even the indirect light of the solar shrine is not enough to show the way, Sia perceives the course. This was understood not as a metaphor, but as a description of how the bark navigated. Perception itself walked at the prow. The route was known because the faculty of knowing it had been placed where it needed to be. Who stood with Sia or near him, and who was the personification of the authoritative spoken word? Not speech in general, not language as communication, not words as expression, but the specific creative and directive force of the correctly spoken command, the word that does what it says because it is spoken with the full authority of the divine order behind it. The Egyptians understood certain kinds of speech as operative rather than merely descriptive. When Hu spoke during the night journey, what he said was what happened. He gave voice to the instructions that kept the bark on its course, and that voicing was itself the mechanism by which the course was kept. Alongside these two, Heka traveled with the bark. Heka was magic, not in the colloquial sense of the impossible made to appear possible, but in the Egyptian understanding of a fundamental and real power that existed within the structure of creation and could be engaged by those who knew its operations. Throughout the night journey, as the solar bark encountered each successive gate and each successive hazard and each successive region with its own distinct conditions, it was Heka's force that made transformation possible, that allowed what needed to change, and what needed to persist. In the representations of the night journey across various tomb walls and papyri, this crew is shown again and again in slightly varying arrangements, but their presence is constant. The tradition held that the night passage was not managed by Ra alone, resting inside his shrine while the bark moved of its own accord. It was managed by perception and by authoritative command, and by the operative force of magic, all three working together across 12 hours of enclosed and complex passage. The sun withdrawal into the night was not, in this account, a diminishment or a defeat. It was a journey requiring the most specific kinds of divine assistance, undertaken with careful preparation, and described in the tradition with the same meticulous attention to procedure that the Egyptians brought to every ritual they considered essential to the maintenance of the world. The first 3 hours of the journey moved through regions of comparative order. The waterways were open, the bark moved steadily. The corridors through which it passed were inhabited by beings who recognized the sun god's passage and responded to it. Crowds of the blessed dead who received light in the darkness as the bark moved through their regions, briefly illuminated by the shrine's contained radiance, then returned to darkness again after the bark had passed. This rhythm of illumination and withdrawal repeated itself through the early hours. The bark moved, light arrived, light passed on. The tradition held that this was not cruelty but necessity. The light was not the sun's to give freely, not during the night hours, not while the journey was incomplete. It was being carried from one side of the world to the other, and the carrying required that it be held. The 4th and 5th hours brought the bark into a different kind of terrain entirely. This was the domain of Sokar, a god of a much older and stranger order than the more familiar figures of the Egyptian tradition. Sokar, whose realm sat at the deepest point of the Duat's geography, whose territory was not a waterway at all, but a dense and enclosed darkness that the Egyptian texts describe in terms that resist easy summary. What the tradition records is this: in the 4th and 5th hours, the waterway on which the bark traveled disappeared. The river simply ended. There was no water ahead, no corridor wide enough for a vessel to float through, no channel by which the Mesektet could continue in the form it had maintained through the earlier hours. The bark had to be drawn up onto land and towed. The image of this in the Duat is one of the most striking in the entire text. The Mesektet, that high-prowed ceremonial vessel, sits on a serpent-headed sledge, a low platform mounted on runners, shaped so that its forward face is the head of a serpent, its body the runners, on which the whole vessel rests. And in the register below, a group of divine figures is shown with ropes over their shoulders, bent forward, debitowing the sun across dry land. The ground beneath the runners is pale and fine, the sand of the Sokar region, described in the texts as dense and deep, and unlike the ordinary sand of the desert, a substance that belongs to the interior of the earth in a way the desert's surface sand does not. Above the sledge, the sky of the Duat in these hours is absolute black. The tradition gives this region no secondary illumination, no borrowed light from any other source. What light exists is the light contained inside the shrine on the bark's deck, and in the 5th hour, even that seems pressed close by the surrounding darkness, reduced to the smallest possible flame. The reason the tradition placed this ordeal at the fourth and fifth hours was cosmological rather than arbitrary. The fourth and fifth hours represented the nadir of the solar journey, the point farthest from both the sunset of the previous evening and the sunrise of the coming morning, the hour at which the sun was most completely inside the world and most completely removed from the sky. Every night, in the Egyptian account, the sun passed through this condition, not gliding smoothly through an even darkness, but dragged across the dry floor of the world's deep interior by figures straining forward with ropes, and every night it passed through. The sledge moved, the divine crew bent and pulled, the sand accepted the runners. The fifth hour passed into the sixth, the terrain changed, the channel reappeared, the Mesektet was returned to its waterway, and the crew resumed their stations, and the bark moved forward again. The sixth hour stood alone among the 12. It was the precise midpoint of the night, the moment at which the journey had come as far from its beginning as it was still from its end, equidistant between the western gate and the eastern horizon, and the tradition described something occurring at this hour that occurred at no other hour and under no other conditions. At the sixth hour, Ra and Osiris met. They did not merely encounter each other in the same corridor. The tradition held that at the sixth hour, the two divine figures merged into a single composite being, a union so complete that the figure the Duat depicts wears both the solar disk of Ra and the Atef crown of Osiris at once, both symbolic vocabularies contained in one standing form. This figure is sometimes labeled Ra Osiris in scholarly translations, though the texts themselves describe the merging in other terms. The logic of this union was precise. Rhea was the sun, the force that moved through the sky, that brought light and warmth and the conditions under which living things could live, that completed its circuit above the world in the hours of daylight and needed, each night, to be restored. Osiris was the lord of the dead, the god who had died and been reconstituted, whose resurrection was not the same as the avoidance of death, but the passage through it and the transformation it produced. In the Egyptian understanding, these two divine conditions were not opposed but complementary, and their complementarity required demonstration. At the sixth hour, Ra breathed life into Osiris. At the sixth hour, Osiris lent his power of chthonic resurrection to Ra. One gave the other what it needed. The sun resting in the Duat received the capacity for renewal that only the Lord of the Underworld could provide. The Lord of the Underworld received the animating force of the solar power that keeps all living things alive. The moment of their union was also understood as the moment at which the restoration of the sun was assured. Before the sixth hour, the night journey was still in its difficult descent, the nadir of the Sokar passage, still present in the recent hours, the outcome of the journey not yet secured. After the sixth hour, something had been accomplished that could not be undone. The sun had been renewed at its source. The second half of the journey was a return, not easy, still traversing 9 remaining hours of the Duat's interior, still requiring Sia and Hu and Heka at their stations, still passing through gates and regions with their own conditions, but a return nonetheless. The direction of the night's movement had shifted from descent to ascent, and the tradition understood that shift as cosmological fact rather than merely metaphorical description. The seventh hour brought a challenge that the tradition named and described with careful specificity. This was the hour most associated with the threat of Apophis, that vast serpent whose nature was not like the serpents of the Duat's earlier and later hours, the guardian serpents who stood at gates, the Uraeus figures who flanked corridors with their contained fire. Apophis was different in kind, where the guardian serpents served the system of the Duat's order, operating within it as functional components of the night structure. Apophis lay outside every system. It was not malevolent in the way a hostile person might be malevolent, with grievances and intentions. It was the negation of movement, the tendency toward stillness and dissolution, the force that would, if it could, bring the night journey to a stop before its completion. In the seventh hour, the bark's crew confronted this force with binding spells and ropes and knives, and the texts of the Duat provide the specific procedures by which Apophis was restrained. These were not improvised responses to an unexpected threat. They were performed procedures, enacted correctly and in order, as they had been enacted in every previous night, and as they would be enacted in every night to come. What the tradition makes clear is that Apophis was never permanently defeated. The binding in the seventh hour did not end the serpent. The spells did not dissolve it. The work of restraint had to be done each night, because each night the force Apophis represented reasserted itself and had to be met again by the same careful, specific opposition. The Egyptians understood this not as evidence of the sun's precariousness, but as a description of how the world was constituted. Order and its negation perpetually present. Order perpetually requiring maintenance, the maintenance perpetually successful. The seventh hour passed. The bark moved forward. Apophis remained in the condition of restraint. The procedure had worked again, as it always worked, because the crew who performed it were the crew for whom the procedures had been written. The 8th, 9th, and 10th hours moved through regions of increasing differentiation. The texts of the Duat describe each of these hours with the same meticulous attention they bring to all the others. The names of the corridor's inhabitants, the nature of the terrain, the condition of the waterway, the specific arrangements of beings who populated each section. Different categories of the dead occupied different regions, receiving their allotted portions of the sun's passage, the light from the shrine reaching them for the duration of the bark's transit, then withdrawing. Some regions in these hours are described in the texts as housing those who had been justified, whose hearts had been found correct in the weighing, and who now inhabited their portion of the Duat, in the condition the tradition called Imaku, the venerated, the honored, those whose afterlife was characterized by access to food and light, and the company of the gods. Others housed different kinds of beings, figures with specific functions in the Duat's operation, divine figures whose roles within the night structure the tradition cataloged with the same precision it applied to everything else. The 11th hour brought the bark close to the world's end, close to the point at which the Duat's interior yielded to the eastern passage, where the darkness of the enclosed underworld gave way to the approach of morning. In the 11th hour, the texts describe a region whose sky, or what passed for sky in this part of the Duat, had a quality different from the absolute black of the middle hours. The tradition does not describe this as light exactly. It was more a change in the quality of the darkness of the 11th hour compared to the darkness of the 5th hour, the way the sky over the desert at the end of astronomical twilight compares to the sky over the desert at midnight, not yet day. The stars still visible, but changed. The figures in the 11th hour had roles oriented toward preparation for the emergence rather than toward the management of the night's interior. The texts describe transformations occurring in this region, forms assumed by the sun god in anticipation of what the 12th hour would require. The ram-headed Ra inside his shrine began, in some accounts, to shift toward the other form that the tradition associated with the dawn, the scarab beetle, Khepri, whose name was understood to be related to the Egyptian word for becoming, for coming into being. The sun was not the same entity in the morning that it had been at noon or at the moment of its evening setting. Each position in the daily cycle had its own form, its own name, its own divine identity within the larger continuity of the solar power. The 11th hour was the hour of the preparation for the transformation that the 12th would complete. What the bark entered in the 12th hour was a passage unlike the previous 11. The tradition described it as the body of Nut herself, the sky goddess whose arching form had enclosed the night from above through all the hours of the journey, who was simultaneously the sky the sun would travel through during the coming day, and the passageway through which the sun had to move to reach that sky. The Mesektet, that vessel that had moved through waterways and been dragged across dry sand and navigated through gate after gate of the Duat's interior, now passed through the goddess's body as though through the final corridor of a birth. This was not a metaphor the tradition held at arm's length. Nut swallowed the sun each evening at the western horizon. The sun spent the night moving through her. At the eastern horizon, she gave birth to it again at dawn. On the painted lids of Egyptian coffins, her arching body was depicted in exactly this orientation. Her arms and legs at the corners, her belly toward the interior of the lid, her skin dark and covered with stars, her face at the eastern end, where the coffin's head rested. She was the night. She was the space through which the night was traversed. And at the 12th hour, the sun's traversal of her body reached its end. By Bractidamage's depiction of the 12th hour, the solar figure that emerges from Noah's body at the eastern end is no longer the aged ram-headed Ra who entered the death at sunset. It is Khepri, the scarab beetle, the morning form of the sun, the becoming rather than the having become, in various representations across different tomb walls and papyri. This moment of emergence is shown with the scarab beetle pushing the solar disk upward from between the outstretched arms of a kneeling figure, or rising from the waters of the cosmic ocean, or held between the paws of a great figure whose body bridges the transition between night and day. The solar disk in these images is rising, its motion is upward and definite. Around it, the absolute black of the death's final gate gives way, not all at once, not in a sudden flooding of light, but in the gradual shift that actual dawn produces. The way the eastern sky over the Nile begins its change from black to the particular dark blue that precedes the first pale band of color above the hills. The hills on the eastern bank of the Nile, in the geography of the Egyptian world, were not the same as the cliffs on the western bank. The west was the land of the dead, the direction of the setting sun, and the entry into the death, the place where the necropolis stood, and the tombs were cut, and the long process of the night journey began. The east was the land of the living, the direction of the rising sun, the direction from which the day arrived. Across the river from any of the great New Kingdom necropolises, the eastern bank's hills caught the first light of morning before anything else, before the sun had risen fully above the horizon, before it had cleared whatever particular angle of the landscape lay between the observer and the east. The hills would already be lit, their stone would already be warm. The color that came back at them from the first morning light was not yet the full gold of direct sun, but something earlier than that, a pale, almost colorless illumination that made everything it touched visible without yet making it warm. The tradition held that this morning light was what the 12th hour had produced, not as a poetic description of a natural process observed from outside, but as a literal cosmological account of why morning came, because the solar bark had completed its passage, because the 12 hours of the night had been traversed, because Ra and Osiris had met at the midpoint and the necessary exchange had occurred, because Apophis had been bound in the 7th hour and the bark's course had been maintained, because Sia had perceived the way forward through every corridor of the darkness, because Hu had given voice to the commands that kept the vessel moving, because Heka's force had made transformation possible at each of the moments when transformation was required. The sun rising over the eastern hills was the outcome of a process. The process was the night journey. The night journey was real. In the tomb of Thutmose III, the painted figures of the Amdeth's 12 hours wrap around the oval burial chamber in their cursive papyrus-like style, beginning with the first hour and continuing through to the 12th. The king was buried at the center of the text. He lay inside the completed record of the night's passage, surrounded on all sides by the 12 hours of the death its interior, with the waterways and the dry sand of the Sokar region, and the gates and the creatures and the crew of the Mesektet, all present in their ordered sequence around him. This was not incidental to the tomb's design, and the pharaoh's resurrection was understood to be bound to the sun's resurrection. His passage through death was the same structure as the bark's passage through the night, and depicting the night journey around his burial chamber made that correspondence physically present in the stone. He was inside the text. The text described the successful completion of the journey, and so the logic ran: the journey would be completed. What remains of that logic is not located in the belief itself, which was held by a civilization that no longer exists in the form that held it. What remains is the image, the bark moving through the dark corridor of the first hour, the crew at their stations, the shrine with its ram-headed occupant, the painted figures moving in their register along the pale limestone of the chamber wall. What remains is the structure, the 12 hours, the specific inhabitants of each hour, the Sokar passage and its sledge and its dry sand, the 6th hour union of Ra and Osiris, the 12th hour emergence. What remains is the thought at the center of it, which the tradition elaborated into text and image across 3,000 years of consistent attention. That the darkness of the night is not an absence but a region, that the sun does not simply vanish and reappear, but travels, that the travel is specific and detailed and accompanied and successful, and that the success of it is why morning arrives. The Mesektet completes its 12th hour and passes out of the Duat and into the body of Nut, and through the body of Nut and into the sky, and the scarab beetle pushes the solar disk upward between Nut's outstretched arms, and the eastern hills above the Nile catch their first pale light. Below, in the western bank stone, the tombs hold their painted corridors in the dark. The figures on the walls are not moving. They have never moved. They were painted with reed brushes by craftsmen who worked by the light of small lamps filled with oil and salt, and they have remained in the positions they were given for 3,000 years of underground stillness. The bark on its waterway, the crew at their stations, Sia at the prow, the sun inside its shrine, moving. The Duat in the Egyptian account is not a place the sun leaves behind when the night is complete. It remains. Tis 12 hours remain, their corridors and waterways and inhabitants in their ordered sequence, the gates and their keepers in their positions, the field of the Sokar region with its pale sand, the 6th hour corridor where Ra and Osiris meet at the midpoint of every night. The sun moves through it and out of it, and the Duat does not change. The next night the sun will enter again at the western horizon, and Sia will take his position at the prow, and the corridor of the first hour will receive the bark on its dark water. Journey will begin again, from the beginning, in the same order, and with the same crew, and through the same 12 hours, in the same sequence, because the journey is not an event that happens and then stops. It is the structure of the night itself. Every night, above the Nile Valley, the stars that the Egyptians called the imperishable ones turned their slow arcs in the northern sky. They were visible from any quiet, dark place in the valley on any cloudless night, the same stars in the same formations, completing the same circuit, never setting below the horizon, never absent from the sky.